commercial, large-scale plant production, which I never worked with before. But Liberia is also unique in that they've recently come out of civil war, and that really affects the way that agriculture in the country is done. And so that was something that I was very happy to get to see close up, to see what exactly has changed. And during the Civil War, pretty much the entire infrastructure of the country, including the agriculture and the rubber plantations, they were pretty destroyed. So Firestone was the first company to return after the Civil War to resume operations. And this just talks a little bit about how the rebuilding process is going in this country. Okay, so where is Liberia? This is the first question everybody asks me. Most people actually don't know about Liberia, Costa Rica. They think it's, I mean, they're talking about the Iberian Peninsula or Siberia. And to be honest, when I was applying for this internship, I thought I was going to North Africa. But apparently that's Libya, not Liberia. Liberia is this small country right there in West Africa. And that's Libya. Definitely not the same place. And I'm glad I went to Liberia instead, because Libya is currently in civil war, you guys know. And they have no rubber plantations there, so it would be a little difficult for me. So this country was officially founded by freed American slaves as a way to send them to a place, which I'll talk a little bit about later, where they would have more opportunity. It was some people considered it returning them to Africa, to where they could have more opportunities. And these freed slaves, though, they only make up 5% of the population. The area that they went to, which is now Liberia, was already inhabited. There are about 29 local tribes, and there are 29 languages in the area. So English is the official language, but it's estimated that less than half of the people living there speak English. And they've gone through over a decade of conflict that is a result of the tensions between the colonists and the natives there. And the life expectancy, due to both lack of infrastructure and healthcare, is estimated to be 43 years. So definitely there's not much hope for people who are ill or things like that. And this is the location of the world's largest rubber plantation, which is the Firestone rubber plantation where I had an internship at. And they do a summer internship program that they started 2 years ago for, generally it's the kids of the employees, so that you can go there and work in your field, if they have something in your field, so that you can work and get some experience. So a little bit of history about Liberia to understand why they're in the state that they're in right now. The American Colonization Society was a group of Americans that funded and did the logistics behind sending freed blacks to Africa to establish a colony. It's the same that happened in Sierra Leone, where Britain sent their freed blacks to establish a colony there. And this was for conflicting reasons. Some people thought that they couldn't have opportunities, the appropriate opportunities in the United States, so they felt that sending them back would give them more options. But other people were frightened by the intermingling of races, and also the presence of freed blacks was increasing the amount of slave revolts that were happening. So there were a lot of plantation owners that were behind this movement of sending people to colonize West Africa. So when they arrived, there was a lot of conflict with the indigenous groups, and the small 5% of they're called America Liberians, the ones that are descendant from the freed American slaves, and they were in the government, and they controlled pretty much everything in the country, and these armed conflicts were the source of what later became the Civil War. It was established as a colony in 1821, but actually didn't become independent until 1847. And from 1847 until 1980, it was the population was set up with the Americo-Liberians in control of everything, and the natives didn't have access to, weren't able to participate in government or anything like that. So tension between the ruling class and the indigenous groups led to, in 1980, Samuel Doe overthrew the presidency, which ended with the murder of the president and a public execution of 13 of his cabinet members. From 1981 to 1985, he was in power, and he was eventually elected governor. And at first, it was considered there was a lot of freedom for the people that lived there, but there were 7 failed coup attempts. So after that, he became somewhat paranoid and began killing his opponents or anyone who showed any opposition. He actually killed 50 of his opponents prior to the 1985 election. But he won, I guess, because he killed all his opponents. But okay, so they went through 14 years of civil war, even after all this other conflict. The first one, if you guys have heard of Charles Taylor, who's recently on trial, so he put together a rebel group that overthrew the Samuel Doe government, and eventually he was elected in 1997. And he was on trial recently for inciting, for backing the rebel groups in Sierra Leone, And his trial ended, but a verdict won't be given out until later this year. And from the Second Civil War was from 97 to 03. And this consisted of many other rebel groups being formed and fighting for control. And eventually Taylor resigned and was exiled in Nigeria. An interim government was put in place, and they signed a peace agreement with the rebels to stop fighting. And these pictures, the stories of people that had stayed there during the war, they told me stories of the checkpoints and the children soldiers. In Liberia, the Civil War was characterized by a lot of children fighting in the war, and the soldiers, like this one here in the center, wearing wedding dresses and other, just costumes that they would wear when they would go fight. It was considered a way of intimidating the people that they were pursuing, and also some people saw it as when they were in costume, they couldn't be harmed. So this is from actually a documentary, but it just seemed like such a great depiction of all the stories I've heard of when they had seen the soldiers coming, and they were known as like cross-dressing soldiers. That's what Liberia is known for. So the after effects of the war, if you can see at the bottom, these are pictures of Monrovia. There are a lot of destroyed buildings. This one in the center is a bank. It used to be a bank, and now there are people that have taken up residence in there. And over 250,000 people died. Tens of thousands were displaced. There's still a large presence of UN soldiers, about 15,000. So Charles Taylor's trial recently ended, but the infrastructure is still destroyed. And in 2005, the first African female president was elected, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. But it's still, Monrovia has less than 1 million inhabitants, but there's still no electricity, there's still no running water. So it's in a pretty, it just hasn't been rebuilt much. There's a long way to go. And Liberia's main income had always been the rubber industry. And this primarily started in 1926 with Firestone's concession. So the Liberian law, you can't have foreigners owning actual property in the country, and you can only have blacks become citizens. So you have to be a citizen to own property, and you have to be black to be a citizen. So foreign companies, such as Firestone, they do what are called concessions of their long-term lease. It was for 99 years. That's just an alternative to actually owning the property. So they had a 99-year lease, and so they started what's now is still the largest plantation in the world. And in 1974, Liberia actually had the world's largest rubber industry. There were 7 other large companies that had plantations in the area, and it was a huge supplier to the United States. It supplied natural rubber to them during World War II, which is a very strategic wartime commodity. But unfortunately, during the Civil War in the area, the trees that used to be replanted on a 20 to 30-year cycle, there was no replanting done. A lot of the combatants had taken over plantations and were doing what's called destructive tapping, where you're essentially bleeding the tree dry, and you're not letting it means you can't go back periodically for yield, so you pretty much destroyed the tree. So as recently as 2006, ex-combatants were still in control of 2 of the largest plantations in the country. Even though the war technically ended in 2003, the government hasn't quite put back together the army and the police force, so they had no way of getting these combatants. So it was also said that they were forcing people to tap the trees, so they had forced laborers on the plantation. And these are the names of the plantations that were taken over, that were still in control of the combatants. So the UN troops helped them take the combatants out of the farm, and another company signed a long concession for one of the plantations, and the other one is declared under government authority, which means that they haven't decided who's the actual owner. Because there are a lot of people that are saying that they're the owner of the plantation. So that has yet to be decided. The Firestone plantation is over 118,000 acres. It's more of a large city just because the amount of people that live there. There's about 250,000 people living there. Not all of them work there, but we have extended family of, and friends that actually live with the employees. It's because so many people were displaced during the war, but we don't have just nuclear families. We have large extended families. They have a latex and block rubber processing plant, which is where they purchase from the smaller Liberian farmers, and they process it in their factory. They also have a rubber wood factory, which they've started, since there are so many trees that need to be replanted, they cut them down and they're starting to produce rubber wood, which is used for flooring. And I'll talk about that later. They do have a program to distribute rubber saplings to local farmers, because as a way to get the rubber industry going again in the country, they want the independent farmers who also didn't do replanting, they want them to have access to the high-yielding clones, just so that there's more rubber being produced in the country. So I'm not sure how many of you know where rubber comes from, but a lot of people I've spoken to don't know where it comes from, so I'm just going to give you an overview. It's often described as the sap of the rubber tree, but it's actually produced by lenticular cells, which are outside the cambium. So when you're doing a tapping cut, you start at the top and you go down and to the left. What you're doing is you're severing these cells so that the latex starts to ooze out. And it's collected in a cup down here. So after a few hours, the tapper goes back and collects what he harvested and takes it to the weighing station. It's assumed to have a role in herbivore defense for the tree. And the process that makes you able to produce rubber from latex produced in tires is vulcanization, which is where you heat it up with sulfur, and it keeps the rubber from getting sticky with a change in temperature. And it's much more stable. So although the tree is native to, the tree that's planted commercially is the Brazilian rubber tree, the Hevea brasiliensis, the one, most of the production worldwide is in Southeast Asia and Africa. This is because of the presence of South American leaf blight in the Western Hemisphere. It's present in all rubber-growing regions in the Western Hemisphere, and so when you have a monoculture of these high-yielding clones, it'll pretty much devastate the area and you won't be able to produce rubber. But it's not present in Asia, in Southeast Asia, or Africa, so that's where the rubber is being produced right now. It's considered just a matter of time before it gets introduced to those areas, so there's still ongoing research into resistance, so that once it does reach them, there will be clones that people can plant to still be able to produce rubber. So this is a little bit about how Firestone runs their rubber plantation. And they have 2 large nurseries. It's such a large area that they have 2 large nurseries. And with the intensive planting program that they have, their goal is to plant 1 million trees a year. So all these have to be produced on the nursery. They collect seeds from the trees that they have currently, as well as they buy seeds from farmers throughout the country. They plant them, and those seedlings they use as their rootstock. They maintain many budwood clones, so they have a budwood nursery of several clones so that they can use buds of this for grafting onto the rootstocks. So there are about 1 million trees planted annually, depending on how successful they are with clearing the old trees out. And they also produce trees for the local farmers. So far they've given away about 2.2 million saplings, and they're high-yielding saplings, to the area's farmers in order to get the rubber industry started again. Down here you can see this is the planting material that was previously used, and they're switching over. They're called bare root stumps. So essentially you're digging up the plant after it's already been grafted. You trim the top growth and the roots off so that you have just what look like sticks. And that's what the people go out to the field. They transport the people that are going to do the planting as well as the planting material in trucks to the remote locations, and they plant those. But now they're moving over to polybag production, which you can see up here. They've changed a large portion of the nursery over to polybag production, because since the root system is more intact in the polybags, the tree becomes established faster and it starts growing faster, so it takes less time to reach the yield, the size where it can be tapped. So you have less downtime for the tree. So it's definitely worth it, even though it's much harder to carry the bags out, transport them to the field, than it is the bare root stumps. It's worthwhile just to get just so that you have production later on. Okay, so the replanting areas, about each year, 1 million trees are planted on 5,000 acres. And this is the goal, to get back up to speed where they can then resume to their previous replanting cycle. And these ladies, they're given 50 bare root stumps that they plant, and that's their day's work. Once they're done for the day. And the previous day, someone goes and they stake out the field to line up the rows, and they make holes. So the next day, the planters just go out and plant it. And it streamlines the process a bit. And they're using bare root stumps. If you notice the red, that's red wax that's put on the tops of the bare root stumps, just to make sure that there's no mistake in which end goes up, so that it's always the wax, you want the wax on the outside. And it also identifies them as belonging to firestone, because there's a lot of problem with theft. And so if you see stumps planted on an independent farm and they have the red wax on the top, you know they're stolen property. They have a big problem with theft in the country still. They actually employ nighttime security guards for the entire planted areas to prevent people stealing the rubber stumps, because that was a big issue in the beginning. So people steal the rubber stumps and then they sell them to local farmers. There's a small disease management team. Although the area is so large, they have 5 people who go around scouting and treating diseases. And there are only a few diseases that are actually worthwhile for them to treat. In the nursery, they spray for bird's eye leaf spot, which causes significant, it reduces the growth of the nursery stock quite a bit. So they do spray for that. And the field control is for trees that are from 2 to 18 years. Past 18 years, it's not economical for them to treat the trees anymore. So they stick to the blocks that are up to 18 years old. And the main ones that they treat out in the field are what are referred to as white root rot. And this is the main cause of tree mortality on African plantations. There are 2 other root rots, but this is the one that has the biggest impact. And it does have the external growth phase. You can see here in the photos, what they do is they look for leaves that are yellowish or just off color a little bit, and if they can't see any signs of disease on the trunk of the tree, they'll start digging, take a look at how the roots are. And once they find sign of a root rot, they remove the diseased areas and then they paint it with a fungicide. And a similar thing is done with what's called pink disease. This is a stem disease that it doesn't kill the tree, but it greatly reduces yield and growth of the tree. So they go and they remove the diseased branches and portions of the trunk and paint it with a fungicide. So Buchanan Renewable Energy is a company that came into Liberia about 2 years ago. And what they do is their goal is to take the old rubber trees and turn them into renewable energy. So they're helping both the independent farmers. They work out a contract with them where they help them clear the land and replant, and they get to keep the old plant material. And they're turning these into wood chips, and they just built an electricity power plant outside of the capital where this year, the plan was this year they were going to start producing energy to supply the capital. Because as of now, there are a few streetlights that are run on gas-powered generators, but there's really no electricity to the capital or to outside areas unless people own their own gas-powered generators. And there are upscale hotels and restaurants in Monrovia, but those, again, the owners have a bunch of generators that they run. Otherwise, there would be no electricity. So I was there, and they were clearing large areas. And the reason this past year, they shoot for 1 million trees to replant. But this past year, they only got 640,000 because of technical problems with some of the machinery. They weren't able to clear land at the rate that they wanted to. So one of the good things about the mechanical clearing, they used to do clearing by hand, and then charcoalers would come produce charcoal out of it and take the wood away. But you get much less white root rot when you do mechanical removal because you're taking away the old plant material that would serve as inoculum for the newly planted trees. And the rubber wood factory is also a new thing that they started in 2008. They built a rubber wood mill. And this was, since they have so many trees that need to be cut down, they were finding a new use for them. So what they do is, in Malaysia and some other areas, their heavier wood is actually used in flooring and furniture. So after the trees are cut down, then they're cut to size, pressure treated, and air dried to the appropriate moisture content to then be used for flooring and wood. Although these materials there's not actually furniture being produced here. They're exporting. They're looking for buyers to buy the wood from them, for then someone else to be making the furniture. So this is a work in progress right now, and yeah, it was estimated that it created about 500 additional jobs. Liberia is a country that has, it's estimated about 80% unemployment. So any kind of job creation is, people really put emphasis on creating jobs, however many, just because there's not a lot available. Okay, the project that I was mainly working on involved this cover crop. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it. It's called Mufuna braxiata. You can see it here growing within the rows of young rubber trees. It resembles kudzu in a way, but unlike kudzu, it doesn't readily form roots at the nodes. So if the nodes are touching the ground, they don't root quite as much. And so it's actually difficult to propagate from stem cuttings, and the seeds are very expensive. So I was working with the manager of agricultural operations, and he wanted to plant this on a large scale, but he didn't want to spend the money to purchase the seeds they're produced in a small area in northeast India. That's where the seeds are produced. So it was a huge expense to plant this on a large scale. So he wanted me to find a way to propagate it by cuttings, a way that was economical to where it could be established directly in the fields, as opposed to planting it at the nursery and then transporting it. So it's native to northeast India near the Himalayan mountain range, and it's widely used on tropical plantations such as oil palm and cocoa, but it doesn't actually flower or produce seeds on these tropical plantations. It's believed that it requires cold temperature to flower and produce seed, and it has been induced to flower in some high elevation areas in Malaysia, but even though it flowers, no seed is produced, probably because the pollinator is absent. But that's just something that people are doing research on, because a lot of people want to plant this. One of the benefits that it has is that after the trees are mature and they close, the canopy closes, this plant will still keep growing in the shade. As you know, the other cover crops they're using, the growth is severely slowed down once the canopy closes. And so I was looking at different propagation methods. I tried cuttings in poly bags, with different numbers of nodes, different ages of the vine, and different lengths of vine segments. One thing, we went out to a field area where they had tried planting several of them in the field, and it was about 90% mortality that they had. And we were looking at them, and one of the main problems seemed to be that they were rotting. So the nodes below the ground were put quite deep below the ground, and they were rotting. So one thing I was looking at was to mix something else to make the soil drain better, and not planting them so deep. So I tried some horizontal cuttings as opposed to straight down, just to see what I would get the best rooting success with. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of the rainy season. So I had this section of the nursery dedicated to trying to propagate this cover crop, and then it rained for several days nonstop, and my plants were actually submerged underwater for about 4 days. So considering this is a plant that rots very easily, 4 days submerged underwater, yet most of them died. You can see here, you can see some of them, they're hanging on, but no, they eventually died. And this is actually a Buchanan Renewable Energy truck. They were taking wood chips to the Capitol, and the driver misjudged the depth of the water. He thought he could drive through it, and the truck tipped over, and the wood chips were strewn all over the place. And they actually had to wait about a week until they were able to reach the truck to get it right side up and remove it, because it was just flooded for so long. So it's because of this that I had a lot of mortality, but overall I was able to draw some conclusions of it and make some recommendations for him on what to plant. So one thing that I recommended to him was if he wanted to do the infield planting directly in the field, was during transport it seemed like a lot of things were becoming desiccated and damaged because they're transported in the backs of trucks. So I recommended not only keeping them in water, but also covering them so that the wind wouldn't damage it. And definitely the ones that had the greatest amount of root production were the ones that were planted horizontally. Here you can see this is after the flood, when a lot of the soil was washed away. So you had considerable root production on most of the ones that were planted just slightly horizontal, with one node barely below the surface. Another problem I saw with the ones in the field is that it's pretty difficult to tell which is the distal end versus the basal end. So lots of the cuttings were planted upside down, because you'll get roots produced, little tiny roots produced at the distal end, so people assume like, oh, it has roots, that should go at the bottom. And I tried several times planting ones with roots upside down, and all of them died. So I showed them that when the petioles at the bottom, regardless of where the roots are, just explain to the field workers that it's actually not based on where the roots are, but where the petiole is, and you determine which one should go at the bottom, which one should go underground. And here on the right is my bodyguard and my driver, who, since I worked in the remote areas of the plantation, he actually picked me up every day and stayed with me every day and took me back. So he learned a lot about this cover crop while we were out there. And that's his daughter that he brought to introduce me to, David and Anna. And oh yes, another thing was a plant material that had nodes very close together, like ones that had been driven over by a car, and so they started sprouting a lot of shoots on the side. Those actually were all very successful very quickly. That's a harder material to get. I noticed that those all rooted very quickly and were successful. And this is the second project that I worked on. I worked with a factory engineer. The processed water that comes from the latex and block rubber plants, it has a lot of excess nutrients in it that they don't want to discharge directly into the water. So they built they have a clarification tank, and then the final treatment is it goes through wetland. And then at the end, after it's gone through the wetland, they sample the water for the water quality. And he wanted me to help him identify what plants were actually growing in the wetland, because he was unfamiliar with them, and also to recommend some other species based on what nutrients he wanted taken up from the water. So one of the main plants that they had that was growing in the area before was, you guys might recognize, some people refer to it as Chinese spinach. It's right here. And this is actually the wetland after the heavy rains, the berms broke, and this is just them rebuilding the berms and replanting the plants here. But one of the nutrients that they had the most of were just phosphates. So he was looking for what plant he could plant to have more phosphates taken out of the water. And other people had recommended water hyacinth, which is very invasive, but it takes up takes up a large amount of phosphates and then can be harvested. So you're actually removing phosphates and then you can do whatever with it, like burn it or whatever you want to do with the plant. So they're looking into Plantation water hyacinth for phosphate uptake, as well as using some of the outflow to irrigate the nursery. That's what's going to be started next year, just irrigating with some of this water. And this is a photo which I just had to include because one of the things, I don't know if you guys can tell, but there's 4 guys on a motorcycle. They're called Pem Pem, and it's the motor taxi. So you can pay, and the thing is you can get on the taxi, but that doesn't mean that only you are going to get on the motorcycle taxi. He's going to keep stopping. And I actually saw an amazing amount of furniture and things like that being carried with multiple people on a motorcycle. And it was really an image that stuck with me just because of how people innovated. What you thought wasn't possible, it was like, no, of course you can do it. One thing that the factory engineer told me is that they had problems finding parts for like the old machinery they had in the factory. And his Liberian workers were just like, oh, okay, we don't have that part, but we'll just make it out of this part. And that they would actually take something and they would make it so that it worked. And he was just astounded that in the United States, like oftentimes you won't just like make it out of something else. You go and you try to buy the proper part. So I don't know if any of you do have questions about this or rubber in general. Feel free. Yes.
Yeah, the clones that you're talking about, so the improved clones, where did they get that particular